the jungle consumes everything. It preys on the old, the sick, the wounded, the weak, but never the strong.
You can stay here, my pretty princess, and play video games. I want to go home.
This is our home.
A man who once belonged to the jungle now walks through polished rooms in London wearing a tailored suit, carrying a name that civilization understands better than the life he left behind. That contradiction is the first clue inside the legend of Tarzan. Tarzan is not introduced as a wild man trying to become civilized. He has already crossed that bridge. The real question is whether the civilized world has actually changed him, or whether the jungle is simply waiting for him to remember who he has always been. Welcome to the Film Box, where we do not just follow a story from beginning to end, we look at the choices hiding underneath it, the images, the contradictions, the small details that seem decorative until you connect them to something much bigger. Every film is a box, we open it together, and this time the box contains two versions of the same man. There is John Clayton Lord Greystoke, dressed for society, living beside Dame, surrounded by rules, reputation, and expectations. Then there is Tarzan, the identity attached to trees, scars, instinct, memory, and a world that does not care about titles. The movie constantly pushes those identities toward each other, and the interesting part is not simply watching him return to Africa. It is watching the film ask whether he ever truly left. That gives the legend of Tarzan a slightly different starting point from the version of this character most people already know. We are not beginning with the orphan child learning how to survive. We arrive after the famous transformation has supposedly finished. Tarzan has already become John Clayton. He has already stepped into another life. So why does a movie feel like something inside him is still unfinished? That is the compartment we are going to keep opening. Because beneath the large-scale adventure, the jungle chases, the romance, and the physical spectacle, there is a story about identity being tested by distance. You can change your clothes, you can change your home, you can change the name people use when they speak to you. But memory does not always accept the new version so easily. And the film understands that visually before it ever needs to explain it. Watch the way Tarzan occupies civilized spaces. Watch the restraint in his body. Watch how carefully controlled everything feels around him. Then compare that with what happens when the natural world begins pulling him back toward the person he used to be. That contrast becomes more important than any single action sequence because it gives those sequences a purpose. The movement is not only physical, it is psychological. That is why this episode is not going to treat Tarzan simply as a hero returning to familiar territory. We are going to follow the clues surrounding that return. What does the jungle represent to him now? Why does the film make his past feel almost like another character? Why does Jane matter to the balance between the two identities? And why does the story repeatedly connect freedom with something dangerous, powerful, and impossible to completely control? Some of those answers are obvious, others are hiding in plain sight. And as we move deeper, we will also have to separate what the movie genuinely does well from what its ambition sometimes struggles to support. Because the legend of Tarzan wants to be several things at once: an adventure, a romance, a mythic return story, a historical drama, and a modern reworking of an extremely familiar character. That combination creates some of its strongest moments. It also creates some of its biggest problems. But before we judge any of that, we need to understand the mechanism the film builds around Tarzan himself. Because once you notice that the story begins with a man who seems completely separated from his old world, one question becomes impossible to ignore. What happens when that world calls him back? The most interesting thing about the legend of Tarzan is not that Tarzan goes back to the jungle. It is that the jungle seems to recognize him before he fully recognizes himself. That difference matters. Because this is not the story of a man discovering where he belongs for the first time. It is the story of someone who has already chosen another life, built another identity, and convinced himself that the old one can remain behind him. Tarzan begins this film with distance between himself and the legend attached to his name. He is no longer swinging through trees. He is no longer living according to instinct. He is John Clayton now. At least, that is what the civilized world sees. But the film keeps placing tiny cracks in that identity. There is something unusual about the way he carries himself. Too controlled, too observant, too physically aware of the space around him. Even when nothing dramatic is happening, you can feel that this is a man performing normality rather than someone completely shaped by it. And that becomes a hook. Because the moment the possibility of returning to Africa appears, the story stops feeling like an ordinary adventure setup. It becomes a confrontation between identity and memory. Imagine spending years becoming the person everyone expects you to be, only to step back into a place where none of those expectations matter. Your title disappears. Your social position means nothing. Your carefully constructed identity loses its protection. What remains? That is the tension hiding underneath this movie. And the clever thing is that Tarzan himself is not the only character carrying it. Jane understands something about him that polite society cannot. She knows the distance between John Clayton and Tarzan is not as large as it looks. Their relationship gives the film an emotional counterweight because she is not simply attached to one version of him. She understands both. So when the story begins pulling them toward Africa, the question is not simply whether Tarzan can survive there. Of course he can. That would be too easy. The better question is what returning there might awaken. And once you begin watching the movie through that lens, even its physicality changes meaning. Strength is not just strength. Movement is not just spectacle. Silence becomes communication. The way Tarzan looks at animals, landscapes, danger, and other people begins telling us things before the screenplay does. That is our first real mechanism. The film uses recognition. Different words recognize different versions of this man. London recognizes the aristocrat. Jane recognizes the person underneath both identities. And somewhere far beyond those drawing rooms, another world remembers Tarzan. That creates a fascinating tension because the movie asks you to watch a legend who is almost trying not to be legendary anymore. And when you think about it, that is a risky direction for a character this famous. Most Tarzan stories are built around discovery. A boy grows into the jungle. An outsider encounters him. Civilization enters his world. The conflict comes from someone learning who Tarzan is. This film reverses that energy. Everyone already knows. The question is whether Tarzan himself still accepts it. That is why the journey back matters before anything has even happened. It is not just geography, it is pressure. Every mile toward Africa removes another layer of distance between the man he has become and the identity he left behind. And that is where the movie becomes more interesting than its basic premise suggests. Because beneath the adventure is a challenge that almost anyone can recognize. How much can your life change before your past stops having power over you? Can it ever? Or are there parts of us that simply wait for the right place, the right memory, or the right pressure to return? The legend of Tarzan builds its adventure around that question. But to understand why this particular version of Tarzan looks, moves, and feels the way it does, we need to leave the story for a moment and look behind the lens. Because some of the choices made before the cameras ever rolled explain exactly why this Tarzan feels so different. Before Tarzan ever returns to the jungle, one production decision tells us almost everything about the version of him David Yates wanted to create. Yates was not interested in beginning with the familiar origin story. After directing the final 4 Harry Potter films, he came to this project with Alexander Skarsgård already positioned as an older Tarzan who had left Africa behind and become Lord Greystoke. The film was conceived less like another introduction to the character and more like a continuation of a legend the audience was expected to recognize. That decision changes the entire mechanism of the movie. An origin story normally builds toward transformation. You watch someone gradually become extraordinary. Here, the transformation has happened before the opening frame. Tarzan's mythology exists somewhere in his past, so the filmmaking challenge becomes almost the reverse. How do you take a controlled Victorian gentleman and gradually reveal the physical creature underneath him? The costume department found one of the smartest answers. During a visit to the production, costume designer Ruth Myers explained that Tarzan's clothing begins formal, tight, and restrained, then becomes increasingly damaged as the journey continues. Instead of suddenly giving him the traditional costume associated with the character, the film allows his civilized clothes to deteriorate until what remains visually approaches that familiar image. Think about what that accomplishes. The costume is effectively peeling John Clayton away. At the beginning, clothing creates straight lines around him. It places him inside society. It makes him look contained. But the farther he travels, the less protection that identity receives. Fabric tears, formality disappears, his body becomes more visible. The character does not need to announce that Tarzan is returning. You can watch it happen to his silhouette, and that connects directly to an even more extreme production choice involving Skarsgård himself. The actor later described spending around 9 months working with trainer Magnus Lagerback during the Tarzan production, drastically changing his body for the role. Lagerback has explained that they were specifically trying to avoid making him look like someone who had simply built a conventional gym physique. The emphasis was placed on creating physical characteristics that could suggest the primates among whom Tarzan had grown up. That distinction matters enormously on screen. Tarzan is muscular, obviously, but the film frequently tries to make his body function like evidence rather than decoration. His back, shoulders, posture, crawling movements, climbing ability, and explosive changes of speed are supposed to suggest that his physical vocabulary developed somewhere completely different from the men surrounding him. It means the body itself becomes another group. John Clayton may have learned how to stand inside a drawing room. Tarzan learned how to move through a world with no floor. The filmmakers then faced another problem, creating that world on the scale the story demanded. Much of the jungle environment was not produced by simply sending the principal cast deep into an African rainforest. At Warner Brothers, Studios Labs, then enormous environments were constructed on stages. A contemporary set report described two stages dressed as jungles with huge trees, vines, real dirt, and surrounding scenic work. Production designer Stuart Craig explained that those spaces could be modified to create multiple distinct jungle environments. A second unit captured material in Africa, while the main cast worked with the constructed environments. That knowledge changes the way I look at the movie because suddenly its Africa becomes something closer to remember geography than documentary geography. It is heightened, dense, almost mythological. The jungle does not merely need to convince us that vegetation exists around these characters, it needs to feel capable of swallowing civilization. Trees seem enormous. Paths disappear. Settlements feel temporary compared with everything growing around them. And Tarzan is framed as one of the only human beings who understands that scale naturally. Put these choices together and the design becomes visible. First, the movie begins after the traditional Tarzan story. Then his clothing slowly loses its civilized structure. His physical preparation gives his movement an almost animal vocabulary, and the environment around him grows increasingly capable of supporting that forgotten identity. But there is one more decision that prevents the movie from existing entirely inside fantasy. Samuel L. Jackson's George Washington Williams was based on a real historical figure. Jackson said that researching Williams and the history surrounding King Leopold II's Congo helped him understand the historical dimension that attracted him to the project in the first place. That gave the film an unusual tension. Tarzan belongs to literary mythology. Williams pulls the movie toward history. One character enters Africa carrying a legendary past. The other enters looking for evidence of human exploitation. Those two energies sit beside each other throughout the adventure, and they do not always fit perfectly. But when they do, the film becomes more than a simple jungle fantasy. Tarzan's personal return begins colliding with a world where power is being used for something far uglier than adventure. And now our earlier clue becomes clearer. The movie has been stripping away John Clayton's protective layers before the story has even fully opened its hand. The suit was never just a suit. The body was never just spectacle. Even the jungle was designed to participate in the transformation. Everything is preparing Tarzan to become recognizable again. So now that we know how the filmmakers constructed that return, we can finally open the next compartment and ask what kind of movie they actually built around it. So what exactly is inside this box? The Legend of Tarzan arrived in 2016 under director David Yates, with Alexander Skarsgård playing John Clayton, the man the world remembers as Tarzan. Margot Robbie plays Jane, Samuel L. Jackson steps in as George Washington Williams. Christoph Waltz becomes the calculating Leon Rom, and Jemon Honso plays Chief Mbonga. On paper, that combination suggests a large-scale action-adventure, and technically that is what the movie is. But that description misses what makes this particular Tarzan story different. Because the film does not want to tell you how Tarzan became Tarzan, it wants to know what happens afterward. That immediately separates it from the most familiar shape of the legend. Edgar Rice Burroughs created Tarzan more than a century before this movie, and generations of adaptations have returned to the same irresistible foundation. A human child raised outside conventional civilization who grows into a figure existing somewhere between two worlds. This film begins after that conflict should theoretically be solved. John Clayton has chosen civilization, he has married Jane, he has inherited the Greystoke name, he has built a life that appears stable. And yet the movie exists because stability is not the same thing as resolution. At its heart, this is a return story. Not simply a return to Africa, but a return to an identity that John has carefully placed at a distance. That is why I think calling the movie only an action-adventure undersells its strongest idea. The action is the outer shell. Inside it is a story about whether you can move forward without denying the person you used to be. And importantly, the film does not position Jane as someone waiting to discover Tarzan's strange past. She already knows him. That changes their romance. Jane is not standing between civilization and the jungle asking John to choose one side. She is one of the few people capable of seeing that both versions belong to the same man. Margot Robbie plays her with enough confidence and resistance that the relationship feels less like Tarzan protecting a fragile connection to civilization and more like two people carrying a shared history back into dangerous territory. Then George Washington Williams introduces another layer. His presence pulls the adventure toward the historical abuses connected with King Leopold II's Congo. Suddenly, Tarzan's personal homecoming is moving through a story concerned with exploitation, greed, and outsiders treating Africa as something that can be possessed. And that creates an important contradiction. Tarzan also has enormous power here, but his relationship with the land is framed through belonging rather than ownership. Leon Rom approaches the world almost from the opposite direction. To him, people, resources, alliances, even Tarzan himself can become pieces in a transaction. Put those two ideas together and the central conflict starts expanding. This is not simply wild man versus villain, it is belonging versus possession, connection versus control. And that is where the movie earns my attention even when its execution is not equally strong in every area. Spoiler free, I would describe The Legend of Tarzan as an ambitious, visually polished adventure with a surprisingly thoughtful foundation underneath a fairly conventional blockbuster structure. It does not completely achieve everything it reaches for. Some supporting ideas deserve more room. Some emotional beats move too quickly. And there are moments when the digital spectacle creates distance, exactly when the film wants intimacy. But there is enough here to make the movie worth opening carefully. If you enjoy mythic adventure, sweeping romance, jungle spectacle, historical texture, and heroes who are already carrying a complicated past when the story begins, there is a lot to engage with. More importantly, there is something to investigate, because we now know why this Tarzan story exists. It is not asking how a man becomes a legend, it is asking what happens when a man tries to live after becoming one. And before the story pushes that question into danger, there is one more compartment we need to examine: the feeling of those opening minutes. When Tarzan is still far from the jungle, but the movie is already quietly telling us that part of him never escaped it. The opening does something I appreciate immediately. It refuses to give us the Tarzan we expect. Before John Clayton becomes the center of the movie, the legend of Tarzan opens in a Congo already shaped by danger, greed, and outside ambition. Leon Rom's expedition reaches Opar searching for diamonds, only to discover that this landscape is not waiting passively to be conquered. Chief Mbonga's appearance turns that encounter into something even more important, because Tarzan's name enters the story before Tarzan himself does. He is already part of the mythology hanging over this world. That immediately gives the opening a darker temperature than I expected. There is mystery here, but not the playful mystery of discovering an exotic adventure world. The atmosphere feels heavy. The jungle is beautiful, but the film does not initially present that beauty as safe or welcoming. Human beings arrive believing they can extract something from it, and almost immediately that confidence is challenged. Then the movie makes its most revealing early transition. We leave that dangerous environment and meet John Clayton in England, and suddenly everything contracts. The jungle feels enormous, unpredictable, almost impossible to contain. John's civilized life feels organized, controlled, and deliberately narrow. He has been away from Africa for years and is now living as Lord Greystoke with Jane. That contrast hooked me more than an immediate action sequence would have, because Alexander Skarsgård does not play these early moments as though Tarzan is desperate to escape his civilized life. That would make the character too obvious. Instead, John appears to have genuinely committed himself to this identity. He is composed, restrained, almost formal enough to make you forget what his body is capable of. Almost. And that word matters. Because even before the movie releases him physically, Skarsgård gives John a presence that does not completely belong inside those elegant surroundings. There is something slightly unnatural about seeing this enormous, intensely controlled man enclosed by Victorian manners. The tension becomes physical before it becomes narrative. That is what caught me during these opening minutes. The film is withholding Tarzan. It knows exactly what image you probably arrive expecting, and instead of delivering it instantly, it makes you stare at John Clayton and search for traces of that image yourself. You begin noticing posture, silence, observation, restraint. The movie turns absence into anticipation. Jane changes the atmosphere again. Margot Robbie brings much more movement and warmth into their scenes. Where John often feels contained, Jane feels emotionally open. She remembers Africa with affection rather than treating it exclusively as a dangerous chapter that has been closed. That difference tells us something important about their marriage without requiring a major explanation. John seems to have survived his past partly by putting distance between himself and it. Jane does not need that same distance. And suddenly returning to Africa becomes emotionally complicated before the journey has even begun. The premise might make you expect John to hear the word Africa and immediately awaken as Tarzan. The opening wisely resists that. His reluctance gives the eventual journey weight. This is not an adventurer waiting for an excuse to return to action. There are memories attached to that place, losses attached to it, and parts of himself that he appears unwilling to disturb. So during roughly those first 10 minutes, what kept me interested was not spectacle, it was pressure. The movie establishes Rom searching for something he wants to possess, Mbonga wanting someone from the past, Jane remembering a home she still loves, and John trying to maintain distance from the identity connecting all of those things. 4 different desires begin moving toward the same place. That is effective setup, and visually the contrast makes the world feel larger than the plot has become yet. London represents order, but you can already feel Africa waiting outside the frame. The movie creates the strange sensation that John has escaped the jungle geographically while remaining connected to it narratively. That is why his calmness becomes suspenseful. You know what the movie is called. You know who this man is. You know that somewhere underneath the suit is the character generations recognize instantly. The question becomes how long the film can keep him contained. And when I realized that was the game being played, I was in. Not because the opening is flawless or especially fast. It is because the film understands anticipation. It lets the legend arrive before the man. It lets Africa remember Tarzan while John Clayton is still trying to live without him. And now that contradiction is ready to become visual language. Because once we start looking closely at the camera movement, lighting, framing, color, and physical composition of this world, we can see that the film has been separating John Clayton from Tarzan in ways that go far beyond the screenplay. The vision strategy of The Legend of Tarzan is built around one tension: intimacy versus scale. Cinematographer Henry Braham described the goal as creating an immersive film where the camera could remain emotionally close to the characters while still communicating the enormous size of the world around them. That sounds simple until you notice how consistently the film uses that idea to separate John Clayton from Tarzan. In London, John often feels contained. Architecture creates boundaries around him. Doorways, furniture, formal rooms, straight lines, tailored clothing, everything reinforces structure. Even when the camera moves, the world around him feels organized. Human civilization has built boxes everywhere, and John has voluntarily placed himself inside one. Africa changes the geometry. Suddenly, horizontal and vertical space becomes unpredictable. Trees extend beyond the frame. Vegetation overlaps characters. Water, fog, rain, cliffs, branches, and uneven ground make the environment feel less designed around human convenience. And that is exactly where Tarzan begins looking more natural. The camera does not merely show him entering a bigger landscape, it gives his body somewhere to make sense. That is an important distinction because a weaker version of this movie might photograph the jungle primarily as postcard scenery. Braham and David Yates wanted something more active. Graham explained that they did not want the camera standing outside the story admiring landscapes from a safe distance. The intention was to place it closer to the emotional action and make its movement feel dynamic. You can feel that philosophy whenever physical movement takes over. Tarzan does not simply travel to the frame. The frame begins trying to travel with him. Forward motion becomes aggressive. Perspective changes quickly. Height suddenly matters. The ground stops functioning as the default place from which human movement is understood, and this connects beautifully with our original clue. John Clayton belongs to rooms. Tarzan belongs to three-dimensional space. The lighting reinforces the same divide. Braham has said that rather than lighting individual shots, he preferred lighting entire sets so the camera could move freely through them. He also designed contrasting emotional states using intense areas of light and darkness while trying to keep the apparent sources believable. That helps explain why the jungle rarely feels uniformly bright. Even daytime can contain deep shadow. Sunlight breaks through canopies instead of flattening everything. Faces can move between visibility and darkness. Rain softens distance. Interiors feel illuminated by sources that appear to belong naturally inside the environment. The result is a jungle that feels beautiful without becoming comfortable. Darkness is important here. This is not the bright, welcoming green of a family adventure where nature automatically represents freedom. The greens are frequently pushed against earth tones, mist, muddy water, wet surfaces, smoke, and shadow. Nature can embrace Tarzan, it can also threaten everyone else. Production design and visual effects then work together to make that scale possible. Large jungle environments were physically constructed at Leavesden, while photography from Gabon and extensive digital extensions expanded those environments beyond what could be built. David Yates described matching light between material photographed in England and background material captured in Gabon, so those separate elements could be blended into one world. Remy Store pushed that approach even further, building an enormous digital vegetation library based on West African environments and extending the jungle above and beyond the practical sets. And that combination matters more than the raw amount of visual effects. The best moments are not the ones screaming, "Look how much technology is here." They are the ones where you stop separating the layers. A practical foreground gives actors something physical to occupy. Real African landscape material adds geographical scale. Digital foliage fills the impossible spaces between them. The illusion works when all three create the same emotional idea. This environment continues far beyond human control. The editing follows a similar principle. When the movie wants John to feel restrained, scenes can breathe around conversation and observation. When Tarzan's physical instincts take control, the rhythm tightens. Movement creates movement. Cuts begin responding to momentum. But importantly, the film does not always rely on frantic editing to communicate strength. Sometimes the most effective choice is simply allowing a physical action to begin in relative stillness. Tarzan can appear motionless, then suddenly the energy changes. That contrast gives his movement weight because you register the control before the release. Even the digital animals are designed around that search for physical credibility. Framister's animation team created the fictional Mangani apes rather than treating them as ordinary real-world gorillas. While Yates wanted Tarzan's movement through the jungle to remain extraordinary without completely abandoning a sense of human physical possibility, that balance is not always invisible. There are shots where the transition from photograph performer to FX-driven movement becomes easier to feel, and when that happens, some of the physical danger loses impact. But the underlying idea remains strong. The filmmaking is constantly trying to erase the border between man and environment without erasing the humanity of the man. And this is where all our compartments begin connecting. The costume gradually removes civilization. The framing removes walls. The lighting makes the jungle unpredictable. The camera gives Tarzan vertical freedom. The production design creates a world larger than human authority. Every technique is pushing John Clayton toward the same transformation, not into someone new, into someone remembered. And now that the filmmaking has prepared that transformation visually, the story itself can begin tightening the mechanism. A man wants to leave his past behind. Other people need that past for their own reasons, and every decision from this point forward brings those two realities closer together. John Clayton's central desire is simple at first: leave Tarzan behind. Then George Washington Williams gives him a reason that makes distance impossible. William suspects that King Leopold's administration in the Congo is hiding something far darker behind its promises of development. John initially has little interest in returning, but the possibility that people are being exploited changes the invitation from ceremonial politics into a moral problem. Jane's determination to return adds another pressure. Africa is not merely John's painful past, it was her home too. So he goes back. And the important thing is that he does not return because he suddenly misses being Tarzan. He returns as John Clayton, carrying responsibility rather than nostalgia. That distinction is about to collapse. When John, Jane, and Williams reach the community connected to John and Jane's earlier life in Africa, the movie briefly gives us something the London scenes could not. John inside a place where people know the history underneath the suit. The want is significant because it reminds us that returning to Africa does not mean returning exclusively to violence or animal instinct. There are human relationships here too. Then Leon Rom destroys that sense of safety. His attack is not random. John has been drawn into a transaction. Chief Mbonga has promised Rom the diamonds of Apar in exchange for Tarzan, while Rom needs wealth to support the much larger machinery of Leopold's ambitions in the Congo. Jane and members of the community are taken, and Williams manages to free John. Now look at what the story has done. John returned, attempting to investigate exploitation. Rom turns John himself into a commodity. Tarzan has become something that can apparently be traded. That is the mechanism becoming visible. Rom looks at Africa and sees resources. He looks at local people and sees labor. He looks at political relationships and sees leverage. He looks at John and sees payment. Everything has a price because everything, in Rom's worldview, can be possessed. John's response moves in the opposite direction. Once Jane is taken, his civilized restraint starts disappearing because the rules of the environment have changed. But the film does not simply flip a switch and transform John into an unstoppable jungle hero. Instead, each stage of the pursuit forces him to recover a different relationship he once had with the land, with his instincts, with the people around him, and eventually with the creatures that once formed his family. Williams follows him, and that pairing is useful because Williams becomes a measurement of how unusual Tarzan really is. What is ordinary terrain to John can be exhausting to someone else. What appears like wilderness to Williams contains roots, signals, relationships, and memories for Tarzan. The jungle stops being background, it becomes language, and suddenly the physical abilities we examined earlier have narrative meaning. John does not dominate this world because he is stronger than everyone inside it. He navigates it because he understands connections that outsiders do not. Their pursuit also uncovers what Rom's operation represents on a larger scale. When John and Williams encounter a train involved in the Belgian system, they discover evidence of enslaved Congolese people and learn about the infrastructure being created to extend control across the territory. Rom's diamonds are therefore not simply treasure for a villain. They are intended to help finance the force necessary to make that system stronger. That changes the scale of John's objective. Saving Jane remains deeply personal. Stopping Rom becomes something bigger. And this is one of the movie's more interesting structural choices, because the intimate story and political story now travel along the same path. Rom needs Jen because she keeps Tarzan moving toward him. He needs Tarzan because Mbonga controls the diamonds he wants. He needs the diamonds because power requires financing. One person connects to another, one motive activates another. The box keeps opening. But then John encounters something Rom cannot reduce to economics. His old family, Akut, now the dominant Mangani, does not greet John's return as the triumphant homecoming of a lost brother. He sees abandonment. That is crucial. Until this point, we have mostly been watching John struggle with whether Tarzan still exists inside him. Akut presents a harsher question. Even if John wants that identity back, does he have the right simply to reclaim it? He left. Time continued without him. The jungle did not freeze waiting for Tarzan to come home. When John faces Akut, strength is not enough. Their confrontation reminds him that belonging comes with responsibility. You cannot disappear from a relationship and expect history to erase the absence. and suddenly the transformation becomes more complicated than tearing away a shirt and moving through trees. Tarzan must face what John Clayton's departure caused. Jane, meanwhile, refuses to become merely the object at the end of his rescue mission. She looks for opportunities to resist Rom and to influence what happens around her. The film repeatedly gives her an understanding of Africa that Rom lacks, which is another variation on the same conflict. Rom believes control comes from holding people physically. Jane understands that relationships travel beyond physical control. That difference matters because Rom's power depends on isolation. Separate Tarzan from Jane, separate communities from their freedom, separate resources from the people who live beside them, turn relationships into transactions. Tarzan's power increasingly depends on reconnection. And then Chief Mbonga finally brings the oldest wound into the open. His hatred of Tarzan is rooted in the death of his son. But that death itself connects to another loss. Mbonga's son killed Kala, Tarzan's adoptive ape mother, and Tarzan retaliated. What had initially looked like a simple revenge agreement is revealed as a chain of grief, in which both men have lost family and responded through violence. This is where the film's central clue changes shape. Tarzan's past is not simply the source of his strength, it contains his failures too. That matters enormously. If returning to the jungle only restored John's power, the story would become a straightforward fantasy about rediscovering your true self. Instead, returning also forces him to rediscover consequences. The old Tarzan was capable of love, loyalty, courage, and extraordinary connection with the natural world. He was also capable of acting from rage. So becoming whole cannot mean blindly becoming the person he was. John has to carry something from civilization back into Tarzan just as surely as Tarzan has to return inside John. Restraint, perspective, the ability to stop when he finally has the opportunity to continue the cycle with Mbonga. The more important victory is not physical, it is refusing to let grief make the next decision. And that refusal creates something Rom cannot understand, a potential alliance. Two men who are connected by revenge begin recognizing the larger threat standing outside their conflict. Rom has been using their pain as currency. He needs them to remain enemies because their hatred is useful to him. The moment that hatred stops controlling them, his mechanism begins falling apart. Now put every piece together. John returned, trying to remain John Clayton. Rom attempted to turn Tarzan into payment. Jane's capture forced John back into the physical language of his past. Williams uncovered the machinery behind Rom's plans. Akut forced John to confront what leaving had meant. Mbonga forced him to confront what his earlier rage had meant. Each obstacle has removed another illusion. Tarzan cannot simply erase John. John cannot erase Tarzan. And neither identity is complete without acknowledging what the other has learned. That is why the story's escalation works best when it is viewed as reconnection rather than transformation. The man is reconnecting with the jungle, with Jane, with his old family, with responsibility, even with the darker parts of his own history. Meanwhile, Rom is becoming more isolated because everything he touches is treated as something to control rather than something to understand. By the time the conflict moves toward its final confrontation, Tarzan's greatest advantage is no longer simply that he is physically extraordinary. It is that he is no longer alone. The very connections John tried to leave behind have become the force Rom cannot calculate. And what began as a return to investigate someone else's exploitation has become something far more personal. John Clayton finally has to decide whether Tarzan is a past he escaped or a part of himself he can carry differently. That choice, not another feat of strength, is where the movie's adventure finally reveals what it has been building toward, and this is the moment the box opens completely. What the legend of Tarzan does best is make restraint feel like strength. Alexander Skarsgård could have played Tarzan as constant aggression. The physique is there. The mythology encourages it. The action genre almost expects it. Instead, some of his most effective moments come when he is doing very little. His John Clayton watches before he moves. He measures people. He keeps emotion compressed. And because a performance begins from that controlled place, every moment when Tarzan's instincts break through carries more weight. The confrontation with Akut is probably the clearest example. On the surface, it gives the film exactly the kind of physical spectacle a Tarzan movie is expected to deliver. But the scene works because the fight is not really about determining who is stronger. It is about recognition. John cannot simply walk back into the jungle and behave as though nothing changed. Akut has lived through his absence. The Mangani world continued without him. What John remembers as family also remembers that he left. Skarsgård's performance lets that realization land physically. The character begins with the confidence of someone returning to familiar territory and ends up confronting the uncomfortable truth that familiarity does not automatically equal belonging. That gives the scene emotional weight beyond the visual effects. Margot Robbie provides a completely different kind of strength. Her Jane could easily have become the traditional person Tarzan spends the movie rescuing, and the screenplay does place her in danger. But Robbie refuses to play her as emotionally helpless. Jane understands the environment, she pushes back against Rom, she watches him carefully, she looks for weaknesses. Most importantly, she understands John in a way almost nobody else does. That relationship is one of the film's strongest structural choices. The romance does not begin during the adventure. We are watching two people who already know each other deeply. That allows the movie to skip the familiar question of whether Jane can accept Tarzan and move towards something more interesting. Whether John can accept that Jane never required him to amputate that part of himself in the first place. Samuel L. Jackson then gives the movie something it desperately needs: movement, humor, human scale. George Washington Williams is surrounded by characters carrying mythic or theatrical weight. Tarzan can appear almost superhuman. Rom behaves with cold precision. Mbonga carries the seriousness of unresolved grief. Williams feels recognizably human beside them. He gets tired. He reacts. He questions what he is seeing. That makes him more than comic relief. He becomes a measuring device for Tarzan's abilities and a moral witness to what is happening in the Congo. Story construction works best when these characters are connected through motivation rather than coincidence. Rom wants Mbonga's diamonds. Mbonga wants Tarzan. Tarzan wants Jane back. Williams wants evidence of exploitation. Jane wants to survive without surrendering control over herself. Those wants overlap. That is the middle of the film forward momentum even when the pacing occasionally becomes uneven. Every character is pulling on another part of the same mechanism. The visual direction is strongest when Tarzan's movement communicates identity. There are moments when he drops the civilized posture completely and his body changes language. He lowers his center of gravity. His shoulders move differently. He stops looking like a large man running through the jungle and begins looking like someone who understands the jungle's vertical dimension instinctively. That distinction is essential. A Tarzan film can have expensive landscapes and impressive digital creatures and still fail if Tarzan appears like an ordinary action hero placed inside them. The better sequences here avoid that. They make his movement feel culturally and emotionally connected to the environment. The sound design helps sell that transformation. The jungle is rarely silent. Animals, insects, water, distant movement, human voices, and environmental texture create a space that seems to communicate beyond spoken language. When Tarzan responds with chords or recognizes sounds around him, the soundtrack briefly allows you to experience the environment the way he might. That makes sound part of characterization. Rupert Gregson Williams' score supports the movie's scale without completely overwhelming its quieter emotional beats. The music becomes especially effective when it bridges personal memory with adventure, allowing Tarzan's return to feel larger than a simple rescue mission. But for me, the film's most memorable sequence is the buffalo stampede toward the climax. Not because it is the most subtle moment. It absolutely is not. It is massive blockbuster filmmaking. And that is precisely why it works. Everything the movie has been building about connection suddenly becomes physical. Rom understands power as something imposed from above. Soldiers, weapons, money, contracts, captivity. Tarzan's answer comes through relationships Rom never understood well enough to calculate. The natural world is not presented as Tarzan's personal army in any simple sense. The sequence works more symbolically than that. It represents the return of everything Rom has underestimated: scale, instinct, community, terrain, and the limits of human control. The image of civilization's machinery being overwhelmed by something much larger completes a visual argument that began when John Clayton was sitting inside carefully controlled rooms in England. Those rooms told us humans could organize the world. The jungle kept telling us otherwise. And that is where the legend of Tarzan is at its best. Not when it tries merely to prove that Tarzan is powerful, when it shows us why his power works differently. He does not become extraordinary by standing above everything around him. He becomes extraordinary when he remembers how deeply he is connected to it. That idea gives the performances, the action, the sound, the production design, and the strongest parts of the story a common purpose. But the existence of a strong idea does not mean every part of the movie serves it equally well. Because once we look beyond what works, there are several places where this box contains compartments that feel thinner than they should. The biggest weakness in The Legend of Tarzan is that the movie often has better ideas than it has time to fully develop. We can see that most clearly in John himself. The concept is strong. A man who has spent years suppressing Tarzan returns to the place that shaped him and is forced to reconcile both identities. But the film sometimes moves through that internal conflict faster than the emotional weight deserves. We understand that Africa matters to him. We understand that leaving mattered. We understand that returning awakens something. But there are moments when the movie jumps from restraint to action before giving us enough quiet space to feel exactly what is changing inside him. That makes the transformation satisfying visually but occasionally thinner emotionally. Chief Mbonga suffers from a similar problem. Once we learn that his hatred of Tarzan grows from a very personal history, the conflict becomes much more interesting. Suddenly, he is not simply another obstacle waiting in the jungle. He is given direction that should be one of the movie's richest relationships. Instead, the story resolves it quickly. We get the information. We understand the connection. But we do not spend enough time inside the consequences. A few more scenes allowing John and Mbonga's shared losses to breathe could have turned their confrontation into one of the film's emotional centers rather than a compelling idea moving rapidly. Toward the next plot requirement, Leon Rom also exposes one of the screenplay's limitations. Greystoke gives him calm menace, and the character's obsession with control fits perfectly with the movie's larger theme. But Rom rarely becomes surprising. He is intelligent, he is composed, he is dangerous. Yet his emotional range remains narrow enough that you usually understand exactly what kind of scene he is going to create before it begins. That is not a failure of performance. It is a limitation of how the villain is written. The film gives Rom a mechanism but not quite enough humanity. And because the story is trying to connect personal revenge, colonial exploitation, romance, mythology, action, spectacle, and historical context, some elements inevitably receive less attention. That is probably the movie's central structural problem. There is simply a lot inside this box, sometimes too much. George Washington Williams brings the historical dimension into the story, but the movie cannot fully investigate that history without slowing down the adventure. So, the colonial context becomes important enough to shape the stakes, yet compressed enough that it occasionally feels like a heavier film, trying to exist underneath a conventional blockbuster. The visual effects create another inconsistency. When the digital environments, animals, and physical performance blend successfully, the movie can feel huge. But when you become aware of the construction, the danger weakens. Tarzan's movement is supposed to feel immediate and physical. If a shot suddenly feels weightless or overly synthetic, you stop feeling the body and start seeing the effect. That matters more here than it might in another fantasy film because physical credibility is central to Tarzan's identity. The pacing also becomes uneven in the middle. There are strong individual sequences, but the film sometimes moves between pursuit, historical exposition, character memory, and action with a rhythm that feels more functional than inevitable. You can sense the screenplay positioning, pacing, and whenever you feel the structure rather than the story, some of the momentum disappears. None of these problems destroy the movie for me. That distinction is important. They're limited. There is a difference. The performances remain committed. The central Tarzan idea remains interesting. The production design gives the adventure scale. Jane has agency and personality. Williams brings life and perspective. But I keep returning to the same feeling. This could have been deeper, not longer simply for the sake of being longer. Deeper, more room for John and Jane, more room for Mbonga, more room for the strange emotional reality of returning to a place that once defined you. More confidence in the quiet conflict instead of rushing toward the next spectacle. Because the strongest version of the legend of Tarzan is already visible inside the movie we received. You can see it whenever the action stops, and John Clayton has to confront what Tarzan actually means. The film just does not always leave that compartment open long enough. And the best way to understand what it does and does not achieve is to place it beside other films that have wrestled with similar ideas of myth, nature, identity, and adventure. The easiest way to understand what the legend of Tarzan is trying to do differently is to place it beside other movies that also build adventure around the collision between humanity and the natural world. Start with The Jungle Book from 2016. Both films revolve around a human being whose identity was shaped outside conventional human society. Both depend heavily on digital environments and animals. Both ask whether belonging is determined by biology, culture, memory, or chosen family. But the emotional direction is almost reversed. Mowgli is still forming his identity. Tarzan is recovering one that gives the Jungle Book a sense of discovery, while the legend of Tarzan carries the weight of memory. Mowgli moves toward understanding who he can become. John Clayton moves backward through the layers of who he already was, and visually, the Jungle Book often integrates its artificial world more seamlessly. Its digital animals frequently feel like complete characters rather than effects serving a human-centered adventure. Tarzan gains something different in exchange: physicality. Alexander Skarsgård's presence makes the relationship between human body and environment central in a way Mowgli's story naturally cannot. Then there is Greystoke, The Legend of Tarzan, Lord of the Apes, from 1984. That film leans much harder into the psychological tragedy of Tarzan existing between civilization and the world that raised him. Compared with it, the 2016 film is clearly more interested in momentum, spectacle, romance, and blockbuster accessibility. And this is where I think The Legend of Tarzan loses an opportunity. Greystoke allows the identity conflict to hurt. The 2016 film understands the same conflict but often converts it into action before the discomfort can fully settle. If what attracts you most to Tarzan is the sadness of belonging completely to neither world, Greystoke digs deeper. If you want that idea wrapped inside a large-scale adventure, the 2016 film is the easier ride. Now put it beside Peter Jackson's King Kong from 2005. These movies share something more interesting than jungles and enormous creatures. Both are fascinated by what happens when outsiders enter a natural world and assume that everything inside it can be captured, classified, transported, or owned. But King Kong makes that collision tragic. Civilization takes something it does not understand and destroys it through possession. The legend of Tarzan places Tarzan on the other side of that equation. He understands the landscape because his relationship with it was built through participation rather than conquest. That makes Leon Rom's philosophy stand out even more clearly. Rom sees value and asks how to acquire it. Tarzan sees connection and asks how to protect it. Finally, there is Apocalypto from 2006, not because the stories are especially similar, but because both movies understand how powerful jungle movement can become when geography itself drives suspense. Apocalypto feels harsher, faster, and much more physically immediate. Its environment rarely feels decorative. Every tree, river, slope, and distance becomes part of survival. That is where the legend of Tarzan sometimes falls short by comparison. Its jungle can look spectacular without always feeling tactile. You admire the scale, but you do not always feel the mud underneath the characters' feet. So, what does Tarzan do that these films do not? It combines several traditions at once: the lost world adventure, the established romance, the returning hero, The colonial era historical framework, the animal mythology, and the superhero like physical spectacle. That mixture is precisely why the film can feel distinctive and overstuffed at the same time. If you love The Legend of Tarzan because of its human and nature connection, The Jungle Book is an obvious next step. If the divided identity fascinated you more than the action, watch Greystoke. If the idea of civilization attempting to possess the natural world interested you, King Kong pushes that theme into much darker territory. And if the jungle pursuit itself was your favorite ingredient, Apocalypto demonstrates how brutally effective environment-driven momentum can be. But if The Legend of Tarzan did not work for you because its emotional ideas felt trapped underneath blockbuster machinery, Greystoke is probably the more revealing alternative. Because comparing these movies exposes the exact position of the 2016 Tarzan. It is not the deepest version of this myth. It is not the most convincing jungle survival film. It is not the most seamless effects showcase. What it does have is a particular combination, a legendary character returning to a world that remembers him, while history, romance, exploitation, and identity all compete for space around that return, and that historical layer matters enough that we now need to open it properly. Because the Africa surrounding Tarzan is not merely an adventure setting. The real history invoked by the film makes the entire fantasy considerably more uncomfortable. When The Legend of Tarzan reached theaters in 2016, Tarzan himself was not a new cinematic discovery. That was the challenge. The character had already existed for more than a century, passing through novels, serials, live action movies, animation, television, and popular culture. By 2016, simply putting a man on a vine and calling him Tarzan was not enough. The fame had to justify why this particular version needed to exist. And it arrived during a period when Hollywood was increasingly looking backward to move forward. Familiar characters were being rebuilt for modern blockbuster audiences. Old properties were being given digital scale, darker visual textures, and contemporary attitudes. Earlier that same year, another famous jungle story, The Jungle Book, demonstrated how modern visual effects filmmaking could transform an old literary property into an enormous cinematic experience. That created a difficult environment for Tarzan. Spectacle alone could no longer be the selling point, so David Yates' film tried something more ambitious. Instead of pretending that the uncomfortable history surrounding European ideas about Africa did not exist, the screenplay placed its fantasy against the Congo Free State and the imperial ambitions associated with King Leopold II, and that choice changes how the movie deserves to be discussed. George Washington Williams was not invented for Tarzan. The real Williams traveled to the Congo Free State in 1890 and became a prominent early critic of abuses committed under Leopold's regime, writing an open letter condemning what he had witnessed. The movie radically fictionalizes how he intersects with Tarzan, of course, but placing a real historical critic inside this adventure signals that the filmmakers wanted colonial exploitation to become part of the text rather than invisible background. That is admirable. It is also complicated. Because Tarzan himself comes from a literary tradition created through Western ideas about Africa, and a modern adaptation cannot simply erase that inheritance by giving the hero anti-colonial enemies. The film is trying to renovate the mythology while still selling the mythology. You can feel that tension throughout it. Jane receives more agency. Williams becomes a moral and historical counterweight. Rom's exploitation is explicitly condemned. African characters are given motives that exist beyond simply helping Tarzan. Yet Tarzan still occupies the center of an African story as an extraordinarily white hero with almost mythological authority over the landscape. That contradiction cannot be completely solved by the movie, but acknowledging it makes the film more interesting than treating the setting as a fantasy playground. Critics were not entirely persuaded. The current Rotten Tomatoes aggregate sits at 36% from critics, while its audience score is noticeably higher at 58%. Metacritic records a 44 out of 100 from 41 critics, placing the overall critical response in mixed territory. That gap makes sense to me. Critics were more likely to focus on the awkward mixture we have already discussed. Ambitious historical themes beside familiar blockbuster mechanics, serious ideas interrupted by digital spectacle, and an identity conflict that does not always receive enough emotion or space. But if you came primarily wanting romance, adventure, a physically imposing Tarzan, large scale jungle imagery, and a straightforward heroic payoff, the movie could be much easier to enjoy. Financially, it was not an insignificant release either. Box Office Mojo records roughly $357 million worldwide against a reported production budget of about $180 million. Those numbers made it a substantial global performer. Although a theatrical gross cannot simply be treated as profit because marketing, distribution, and revenue sharing costs also exist. Awards were never the film's story. It did receive a Saturn Award nomination for Best Action or Adventure Film, while composer Rupert Gregson-Williams received an ASCAP Top Box Office Films Award. But this was not a movie that entered cultural memory through major awards recognition, and I do think something was overlooked. Not necessarily the movie as a complete achievement. The more interesting overlooked element is its premise. Beginning after Tarzan has already abandoned the famous life is genuinely clever. So is using clothing, movement, memory, and landscape to gradually restore an identity rather than simply retelling an origin. A decade later, some parts feel unmistakably tied to 2010's blockbuster filmmaking. The heavy digital environments, the franchise revival ambition, the attempt to make an old property darker and more historically conscious. Those elements date it, but the central question does not. Can you build a new life without betraying the person your past created? That survives. And it leads directly toward one of the strangest compartments surrounding this movie, because once audiences begin asking what Tarzan's return really means, several interpretations emerge that the film never explicitly confirms. Some are surprisingly convincing, others fall apart the moment we test them against the evidence. One of the most persistent audience interpretations surrounding the legend of Tarzan begins with a simple idea: what if this movie is not really a reboot at all? Some Tarzan fans prefer to treat the 2016 film almost like an unofficial continuation of earlier versions of the mythology. You can even find viewers imagining it as a later chapter following Disney's animated Tarzan. While others connect it more broadly with Edgar Rice Burroughs' novels because John is already Lord Greystoke when the story begins, it is a fun theory. But, literally, it does not hold up. The continuities are different. Characters, timelines, histories, and interpretations of Tarzan's world do not line up cleanly enough for the movie to be considered a secret sequel to Disney's version or another adaptation. The stronger version of the theory is thematic. This movie behaves like a sequel to the Tarzan story you already carry in your head. It deliberately skips most of the origin because it assumes the basic legend is familiar. Tarzan was raised by apes. He met Jane. He entered civilization. We receive fragments of that history rather than watching the entire transformation again. So although there is no hidden shared universe to uncover, the film absolutely uses cultural memory as part of its storytelling mechanism. The second interpretation is much stronger. John Clayton never truly stopped being Tarzan. At first, that sounds obvious, but look more closely. The movie does not portray Tarzan as a costume John puts back on. There is no single moment when one personality disappears and another replaces it. Instead, the film keeps showing that Tarzan survived underneath John's restraint, his posture, his awareness, his response to danger, his relationship with Jane, his ability to read the environment. Those things exist before the jungle completely pulls them into the open. This supports an interpretation we have been following since the beginning. John's real problem is not deciding whether he is John Clayton or Tarzan. The problem is believing he has to choose. By the end, the healthiest version of the character is the combination. Tarzan brings instinct, connection, courage, and physical freedom. John brings restraint, experience, and the ability to see consequences differently from the younger man who once responded to grief with rage. Put those two identities together and the return stops being regression, it becomes integration. Then there is a third theory that the movie quietly invites. Tarzan has something almost supernatural about him. Look at the way animals recognize him. Look at how enormous groups of creatures become involved in the climax. Look at how the jungle sometimes seems less like his environment and more like an extension of him. It is easy to read him as a mythical guardian capable of commanding nature, but the film itself gives us a more grounded explanation. Tarzan's connection is based on relationships, learned communication, history, and familiarity rather than explicit supernatural power. The animals are not evidence that he possesses magic. They are evidence that John understands networks Rom cannot see. That distinction actually makes the story better. Rom believes authority comes from ownership. Tarzan demonstrates another kind of authority through belonging. And finally, there is Akut. One reading says Tarzan's confrontation with him exists merely to prove whether John is still physically worthy of the jungle. I think the evidence points somewhere more interesting. Akut is not testing Tarzan's muscles. He is forcing John to acknowledge absence. Tarzan cannot return and automatically reclaim the position he once occupied. The years without him mattered. The jungle moved on. That makes Akut a living reminder that returning home does not mean returning in time. You can recover a relationship. You cannot erase the years you were gone. Of all these interpretations, that is the one I think holds up best because it connects directly to the movie's deepest idea. Tarzan's journey is not about discovering that civilization was fake and the jungle was real. Both were real. Both changed him. And the secret hidden underneath this entire adventure is that becoming whole requires him to stop treating those two lives as enemies. That opens our next compartment. Because once we stop asking which world Tarzan belongs to, we can finally ask the deeper question. What does belonging itself actually mean? Beneath the vines, the animals, the colonial conspiracy, and the action, the legend of Tarzan is really asking a painfully human question. Can you move forward without cutting yourself away from where you came from? John Clayton believes he has already answered that. He survived the jungle. He entered civilization. He built a marriage with Jane. He accepted a title from the outside that looks like progress. But the film gradually suggests that there is a difference between growing beyond your past and pretending your past no longer belongs to you. That is why Tarzan's return matters. Africa is not simply home. It is memory made physical. Everywhere John looks, the landscape contains evidence of another version of himself. The trees remember how he moved. The animals remember how he communicated. The people remember who he was. Even his enemies remember actions that John might prefer to leave buried. He can control how people see him in London. He cannot control what Africa remembers. And that is one of the film's strongest ideas. Your past does not disappear just because you stop speaking about it. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it changes while you are gone. And sometimes you return expecting to recognize everything only to discover that the place has its own memory of you. Akut represents that perfectly. John remembers family. Akut also remembers abandonment. Both memories can be true. That is what makes the encounter deeper than a test of physical dominance. John cannot demand the emotional benefits of belonging without accepting the responsibilities that came with it. The same idea appears through Chief Mbonga. At first, Mbonga seems to represent an unresolved threat from Tarzan's past. But once we understand the grief connecting them, the relationship becomes a mirror. Both men lost someone they considered family. Both responded through anger. Both could continue allowing that pain to determine what happens next. The important change is not that Tarzan suddenly becomes forgiving because civilization made him morally superior. It is that experience has given him another option. He can stop. That might be the most meaningful difference between the younger Tarzan and the man who returns. Strength used to mean surviving. Now strength can mean refusing to repeat yourself. And Jane sits at the center of that integration. She does not love John because he stopped being Tarzan. She does not love Tarzan because John Clayton is somehow false. She recognizes continuity between them. That makes the relationship symbolic without making it abstract. Most of us know what it feels like to show different versions of ourselves in different places. The person you are with family may not be the person you are at work. The person you were 10 years ago may feel almost impossible to reconcile with who you are now. Sometimes growth creates embarrassment about earlier versions of ourselves. Sometimes we become so determined not to go backward that we reject qualities that were never actually the problem. John's journey speaks directly to that feeling. He does not need to become his younger self again. He needs to recover what was valuable without recovering everything that was destructive. That is why movement becomes such a powerful recurring image. In London, John is controlled horizontally by rooms, etiquette, and social expectation. In the jungle, Tarzan moves vertically, up trees, across open space, through environments that cannot be organized into neat human pathways. That visual freedom represents more than athletic ability. It represents a self that no longer has to fit into a single category. And then there is Rome. If Tarzan represents belonging, Rom represents possession. He wants diamonds. He wants territory controlled, he wants people controlled, he wants chain controlled. He even treats Tarzan's body as an object that can complete an exchange. That creates the deeper opposition inside the movie. Possession says, "This belongs to me." Belonging says, "I belong with this." Those statements sound similar, they are almost opposites. Rome's power depends on turning relationships into ownership. Tarzan's power grows when he recognizes that relationships cannot be owned at all. Jane chooses him. The people who help him choose to act. His connection to the animals exists because of history rather than legal authority. Even the jungle refuses to become property simply because outsiders draw borders around it. That is why the natural world repeatedly overwhelms human plans, not because nature is automatically good. The jungle can be violent, unpredictable, terrifying, but it cannot be completely reduced to a transaction, and neither can a human identity. John Clayton cannot place Tarzan in a locked compartment forever. Tarzan cannot erase the experiences that created John Clayton. The complete person exists in the connection. That is the hidden meaning behind a return. Home is not always the place where you stay. Sometimes home is the part of yourself you finally stop running from. And once John understands that, the question changes. We are no longer asking whether Tarzan can return. We are asking what remains of the legend after a man finally learns how to carry it. That takes us into the next compartment, what this 2015 interpretation ultimately added to a character cinema had already been reinventing for generations. The strange thing about the legacy of the legend of Tarzan is that its most interesting contribution may also explain why it never became the beginning of something larger. Tarzan had already been reinvented dozens of times before 2016. Alexander Skarsgård himself questioned why another version was necessary until he encountered the screenplay's unusual starting point. John Clayton, already civilized, already married, already years removed from the jungle. Rather than repeat the origin, the film effectively begins where the familiar legend normally ends. That remains its clearest contribution to Tarzan's screen history. It treats the famous identity as baggage. Earlier adaptations frequently ask how civilization responds to Tarzan. This one asks how Tarzan responds after living inside civilization. That shift did not revolutionize adventure cinema, and we should not pretend later films clearly copied it. There is no reliable evidence of a direct wave of movies influenced specifically by David Yates' Tarzan. Its legacy is smaller than that. It demonstrated one possible way of approaching an overfamiliar character. Skip the story everyone already knows and investigate the emotional consequences afterward. That is a good idea even when the execution remains uneven. The film also attempted something more difficult with the mythology's historical baggage. Yates spoke at the time about being conscious of problematic representations of Africa in older Tarzan material. While this adaptation plays colonial exploitation directly inside its conflict rather than pretending Tarzan existed in a politically empty jungle, that does not magically solve the contradictions of the character. A modern Tarzan movie centered on a European aristocrat moving through colonial Africa will inevitably carry questions the original mythology cannot escape. But the film at least makes those questions visible. That matters when judging its place in the character's history. Then there is the franchise that almost existed. Around the film's release, Yates said there was already a broad plan for a second movie, although further development depended on how audiences responded to the first. That sequel never became a theatrical follow-up, and that absence tells us something. The legend of Tarzan functioned like a franchise starter in an era filled with franchise starter, but it never generated the continuing screen identity that could have transformed this interpretation into the Tarzan of a new generation. So its reputation stayed attached to one movie. Today, the critical divide remains visible. Rotten Tomatoes listed at 36% from critics and 58% from audiences. That feels remarkably appropriate. The film has not undergone some dramatic critical resurrection. It has not become an undisputed modern classic. But neither has it disappeared. There is still something easy to appreciate in its ambition. Skarsgård's physical commitment, Margot Robbie's more assertive Jane, Samuel L. Jackson's historical perspective, Stuart Craig's production design, and the central decision to portray Tarzan as a man returning to an identity rather than discovering one. For film history, that probably places it in an interesting middle position, not definitive, not revolutionary, not forgotten. It is one of those adaptations that reveals how difficult cultural immortality can be. Tarzan survives because every generation can reopen the character, but every new version also has to answer for everything previous generations put inside the box. David Yates' film tried to preserve the adventure while questioning parts of its inheritance. Sometimes those goals fit together. Sometimes you can feel them fighting for space. And that tension may be the most lasting thing about this particular Tarzan. Because now we have followed the clue from the civilized suit to the jungle, from restraint to recognition, from possession to belonging. There is only one compartment left before the verdict, and this time there is nowhere left to hide the details. Alright, full spoilers from this point. If you haven't seen the film yet, close this now. Go watch it and come back when you're ready. Trust me, you'll want to experience it fresh. Now we can finally connect everything. The entire plot has been built around Leon Rom believing Tarzan can be reduced to a transaction. Chief Mbonga wants Tarzan because of the death of his son. Rom wants Mbonga's diamonds because those diamonds can help support Leopold's expansion in the Congo. So Rom effectively places one man's grief inside a larger economic machine. Tarzan becomes payment. That is the hidden mechanism underneath the adventure. And the film spends its climax destroying that idea. When John finally reaches Mbonga, the encounter appears ready to complete the revenge story. Mbonga has waited for the man responsible for his son's death. Tarzan has every reason to fight back. Then the missing piece appears. Mbonga's son had killed Kala, the ape who raised Tarzan as his mother. Tarzan killed him afterward. That revelation matters because suddenly neither man owns the moral high ground. Both are grieving. Both have lost family. Both have allowed that pain to become violence. Rom's entire scheme depends on them seeing only the injury committed against themselves. If Tarzan remains trapped in that perspective, Rom wins even without defeating him physically. But John does something the younger Tarzan might not have done. He stops. He recognizes the grief reflected back at him. That is the real completion of his transformation. Remember our clue from the beginning. John Clayton seemed to have buried Tarzan beneath civilization. The film initially makes us wonder whether he needs to recover the wild man completely. The answer is no. He needs both men. Tarzan gives John the strength to return. John gives Tarzan the maturity to stop repeating the past. That combination is the version of the character capable of breaking Rom's trap. And once Tarzan and Mbonga stop functioning as enemies, Rom's carefully constructed system begins collapsing. Jane has already been resisting him from inside captivity. Williams has already uncovered what Rom's operation is connected to. Akut and the Mangani represent relationships Tarzan thought he had lost. The different compartments now begin closing around the villain. Rom's great mistake is assuming every relationship works like his relationship with power. He controls through leverage. Tarzan connects through history. That distinction becomes spectacularly literal in the final movement toward Boma. Tarzan uses his connection to the natural world to help unleash the massive stampede that tears through the settlement and disrupts Rom's operation. Yes, it is enormous blockbuster spectacle, but look at what the image means. Throughout the movie, European power has attempted to organize Africa into resources, routes, soldiers, contracts, and ownership. Then suddenly, the landscape refuses to remain organized. Animals paw through the human construction. Control becomes chaos. The thing Rome never understood becomes the force he cannot contain. That is why the stampede is more than an action payoff. It is the movie's theme turned into movement. Rom thought power meant standing above everything. Tarzan's power comes from existing within a network larger than himself. And then we reach Jane. Rom takes her toward the ship because she remains his final piece of leverage. Tarzan follows, leading into the last confrontation between two completely different definitions of control. Rom still believes that if he can hold the right person, he controls Tarzan. But by this point, Tarzan is no longer the isolated man we met in England. That is one of the climax's easiest details to overlook. At the beginning, John had separated himself from almost everything that created Tarzan. By the ending, every major connection has returned. Jane, Williams, Mbonga, Akut, the animals, the landscape, his history. He has become powerful not because the film stripped away John Clayton, but because it rebuilt the web around him. Rom cannot understand that. His final struggle with Tarzan therefore becomes almost inevitable. Rom has spent the entire movie wrapping people into arrangements of ownership and force. Even the rosary he carries, used repeatedly with an unsettling sense of ritual and control, becomes associated less with genuine spirituality than with the composed persona through which he exercises domination. Tarzan eventually turns Rom's own obsession with control against him. And Rom's final fate comes through the crocodiles waiting in the water. The movie does not need graphic detail, the meaning is enough. A man who believed the natural world could be exploited, purchased, and controlled ultimately discovers that he was never standing outside that world, he was vulnerable inside it. And once Rom is gone, the larger plan collapses with him, but the final reveal is quieter. The film does not end by sending Tarzan permanently back into the trees as though John Clayton was a mistake. Instead, John and Jane remain in Africa, and the ending shows that they have begun a family. That image resolves the identity question better than another action sequence could. John is not choosing between civilization and the jungle anymore. Jane is not choosing between John and Tarzan. Their future grows from both. The child becomes a symbol of continuity rather than retreat. The past has not been erased. It has been carried forward differently. And that makes the final image of Tarzan moving through the jungle important. Earlier, that movement represented the identity John had suppressed. Now it represents an identity he no longer needs to feel. He can be Lord Greystoke. He can be Jane's husband. He can be connected to human society. And he can still be Tarzan. That is the reveal our original clue has been pointing toward since the tailored suit in London. The suit was never imprisoning a completely separate creature underneath. It represented only one compartment of the same man. The jungle did not transform John into Tarzan. It forced him to acknowledge that Tarzan had never disappeared. Even the movie's recurring images of movement make different sense now. Early restraint meant separation. Later movement means integration. The scars are not simply proof of toughness, they are history written on the body. Akut is not simply an animal ally. He represents a relationship that survived damage. Mbonga is not simply an enemy. He represents the consequences of rage. Jane is not merely someone Tarzan rescues. She is the person who already understood that John never needed to destroy one identity to deserve the other. And Ron represents the opposite philosophy, the belief that everything complicated can eventually be converted into something controllable. A person, a country, a resource, a relationship. The movie rejects that. Some things cannot be possessed without being destroyed. They can only be belonged to. That is why the ending works for me even though the film has taken an uneven road to reach it. The final victory is not Tarzan proving that he is still the strongest creature in the jungle. We already knew he was extraordinary. The real victory is much quieter. John Clayton finally stops treating his own history as something he needs to escape. He returns to the place that made him, confronts what he loved there, confronts what he lost there, confronts what he did there, and emerges without having to become his younger self again. The legend survives. But the man has changed, and that is the last connection inside the box. So, where does the legend of Tarzan finally land? For me, this is a 7 out of 10. There is a genuinely strong movie inside it. Alexander Skarsgård gives Tarzan exactly the kind of physical presence the role demands, but the quieter part of his performance is what interests me more. His restraint makes the return meaningful. Margot Robbie gives Jen warmth, confidence, and enough personality to prevent their relationship from becoming a simple rescue mechanism. Samuel L. Jackson adds energy and humanity exactly when the movie risks becoming too solemn. And visually, there are moments when this film absolutely delivers the myth. Tarzan moving through the jungle, the enormous environments, the relationship between his body and the landscape, the gradual disappearance of John Clayton's civilized exterior. Those things understand the character. What prevents the film from reaching something greater is depth. The ideas are there. John's divided identity, Mbonga's grief, the historical exploitation surrounding the adventure, the difference between possession and belonging. But the screenplay sometimes touches these ideas when it should sit with them. It wants emotional drama, historical weight, romance, mythology, and blockbuster spectacle inside the same film, and not every compartment receives enough room. Still, I would recommend it to anyone who enjoys classical adventure stories presented with modern skill, especially if you like heroes who begin the movie carrying history rather than discovering themselves from nothing. If you want a psychologically deep Tarzan drama, this may leave you wanting more. If heavy digital impairments pull you out of a movie, some sequences may also be difficult to fully embrace. But if you can meet the film where it is a sweeping, imperfect, sincere attempt to reopen an old legend, there is plenty here worth experiencing. For this one, streaming feels like the natural recommendation today. The spectacle absolutely benefits from the biggest screen and strongest sound system available to you. But I would not call it an essential purchase unless Tarzan, Alexander Skarsgård, or this particular style of adventure already has a place in your collection. And after opening every compartment, the thing I keep coming back to is surprisingly simple. Tarzan does not win because he discovers where he belongs. He wins because he finally understands that belonging does not require him to erase half of himself. The jungle did not need John Clayton to disappear. John Clayton needed to stop pretending Tarzan already had. That closes the box. Every film is a box. And we opened this one together. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end of The Legend of Tarzan. If you enjoyed opening this film layer by layer, leave a like and subscribe to the Film Box. It genuinely helps the channel keep digging deeper into the movies we love, question the details that seem simple at first, and find the connections hiding underneath them. And I want to hear your take. Do you think John Clayton truly became Tarzan again when he returned to Africa, or do you think the ending shows that he finally became something new, a complete version of both identities? Put your answer in the comments. I would love to know which side you land on. Until we open the next box, keep looking beyond the obvious. Sometimes the smallest detail is the one holding the entire movie together. Every film is a box, and we've only just started opening them. That's the Film Box. See you in the next one.